What's your grief definition? Dictionary.com's definition of grief lists it as a noun, as keen mental suffering or distress over affliction or loss, sharp sorrow, painful regret, a cause or occasion of keen distress or sorrow. This is such a flat definition. It's so one-dimensional. Today, we are going to explore our very own definitions of grief. I'm Jo McRogers, a social worker who has worked at supporting grief for decades now. My private practice, this YouTube channel, and now my online community called the Grievolution Collective are all dedicated to doing grief differently. So welcome back, or hello if this is your first time here. Please subscribe, like, and turn on the notifications bell, because YouTube is all about numbers, and then they will recognize the important work that we are all doing here. This week in the Grievolution Collective, we were exploring what words describe our grief, and there were many different words, and none of them were repeated. So this led me to reflect and decide to make this video about how do you describe and define your own grief. I have to start today with an admission. Years ago, I would have told you that as a professional, I can support grief. However, I was wrong. I had compassion and patience and some personal experiences with grief, and that didn't qualify me to be a grief worker. Those of us who throw ourselves into the work of being with other people's grief daily, we're a bit of an odd bunch, and there is a sense of dark humor and perspective, and they are essential. So please take this story in context of that. It took me years to understand that the caller to a crisis team that I was a member of, the caller who had accidentally caused their pet hamster's death, was indeed in crisis. While we were working, we were spending time on the phone with people who were actively taking their own lives. We were initiating emergency responses. We were making safety contracts that we knew we really didn't have any ability to enforce. And so the accidental death of a pet hamster at the time seemed small, and I'm not proud of that perspective or that moment. It wasn't until I decided years later to study, focus, train, do my own grief work that I came to recognize the intricacies of grief. Grief is like no other state. But here's the bare truth about grief. Your own grief is your own worst grief. If I were to speak again today with that caller whose hamster had died, that call would be given far more reverence. It would be given more assigned value and more validity. It was not an unkind response, don't get me wrong. It was still met with compassion and care. But now that I know so much more about how grief works, I would like a redo. I would support that call differently. Then there's this phenomenon called the Grief Olympics. Who gets the gold grief medal? My grief is worse than yours because, and these are the kinds of things you'll hear, you had them for 40 years as a partner. I only had mine for 10. You got to say goodbye. I didn't make it in time. You knew that the death was imminent. Mine was a complete shock. You got to hold your baby. Mine died at 8 weeks of pregnancy. I have come to believe that because our grief, our personal grief, is not often held and recognized and validated, that it seeps out at the most inopportune times. It's like a little piece of our hearts are screaming for care and mending. It isn't usually meant to diminish someone else's grief, but more so, it is meant to illuminate our own grief residue that is going largely unseen. However, the griever that hears these grief Olympic statements can only feel less seen, less heard, less cared for. And often that leads to us stopping talking about the grief. And then we carry our residue into someone else's grief, and this can create a repeating pattern. Please leave a comment below if you have ever felt that your grief was diminished by someone else's comment about their own larger grief. The other, how do you define grief, is what I call grief by comparison. These are statements we make to ourselves. Others have it much worse than me. So often these days, I am hearing in my therapy practice people referring to all of the pain and suffering that's going on in the war in the Ukraine. These kinds of statements tell ourselves that at least I'm not facing that level of grief. Joining grief groups can sometimes make us feel that we don't belong because the other people in the group had it so much more worse. There is a danger in this comparison. While comparison is a frequent occurrence, we need to be careful that we aren't telling ourselves the story of just suck it up because others have it worse and they got over it. This narrative doesn't support grief. If you find yourself caught in this distorted thinking, this minimizing, this comparing pattern, I would ask you to challenge it. We can always find someone with a harder story. But see if you can utilize someone else's story as a motivation, not as a minimizing. Try saying to yourself, in the face of my grief, I hope to also find a place of solace as they did. Or, I hope to find the strength that they have found with my own grief. Use this normal tendency of comparison to motivate yourself rather than to diminish. So because grief is unique and personal in so many ways, please don't let others define it for you. Please don't let society define it for you to just get over it and move on. Please don't minimize it yourself through comparison. You alone are able to define your grief, whether it be from the death of a person or a pet. If people around you aren't able to meet your definition of your grief, then please seek a professional who can do that for you. And as you work to define your own grief, I send you kind thoughts, kind words, and a kind heart. Please like and share this video if it has been helpful so that YouTube will know to suggest it to all of those who are hesitantly typing in grief into their search bar. If you want to dive deeper into these types of explorations where your own personal grief is concerned, then look for the link in my comments below about the Grievolution Collective or have a watch of the video that follows this. Thank you and take good care. I'll see you next time.